Okay, welcome back for the last part of One Man's Faith. Wow, time flies when you're having fun. I've got 2 hours left of stuff here. I'm kidding. 3, no. Okay, so we're looking at Kings and we're looking at Solomon, okay? And in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, it said that Solomon loved the Lord and walked in his statutes, and the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there. That was verse 4. For that is where the high place was. That's also where the tabernacle was. So Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings. 1,000 on the altar. And in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. In other words, he was sleeping. And God said, ask what you wish, and I will give it to you. Now keep in mind, listen. In most cases, when you dream, you're like being carried through it. You don't have control over what happens in that dream. If it's a good dream, it's great. If it's a bad dream, we call it a nightmare. Okay? But we don't normally have control. So here is Solomon. He's sleeping. He's dreaming, and God appears to him and says, ask what you wish me to give you. And Solomon says, listen, here's what I want. You've shown great love, great loving kindness to my father, and he walked in your ways. So now, Lord, you have made me king in place of my father, but I'm only a child. I don't know how to go in and how to come out. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people. So give me an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. See, this is coming out of Solomon's subconscious. He hadn't thought this through. And so God says, because you've asked of this and have not asked for yourself for long life, or you haven't asked for riches or for the life of your enemies, but you've asked me for discernment. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you wise and discerning heart, so that there be nobody before you and there'll be nobody after you. And I've also given you what you've not asked for, riches and honor, so that there will not be another king like you in all the days that come. And so it said, Solomon awoke, and behold, he realized it was a dream. It was a real thing to him. Okay? It probably, even in a dream, happened. And so he now becomes the wisest man in the world. And he has his first test when these two women come. Both of them had babies. One of the babies had died because the woman rolled over on it and then stole the living baby. And they were coming before Solomon. And Solomon doesn't know which one is a real mom or anything, but God gives him wisdom. And he said, okay, bring me the baby. Now cut it in two and give a half to each one of them. And the real mother then spoke up and said, no, don't you harm that baby. Go ahead and give it to her. See, that took a wisdom that Solomon didn't have. That was the wisdom of God. And that was the first step in Solomon's wisdom. Now, that doesn't make him the wisest man in the world, because as we see, and as you read Solomon's history, he had, it was in the thousands of women as wives and concubines. Not a wise thing. Okay? But that's kind of where chapter 4 ends. And so now it picks up with, well, let me just say this. Verse 4, chapter 20 says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand of the sea. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. That's a fulfillment of God's prophecy or word to Abraham. He said, if you He said, "Go. I'm going to give you as many descendants as the sand of the sea." Okay, so this is a fulfillment, really, of that prophecy. And it says in verse 24, he had dominion. Solomon had dominion over everything east of the river from Tipsah to Gaza, and he had peace on all sides around him. Interestingly, Solomon, actually in the Hebrew, is Shlomo. And Shlomo comes from shalom, and shalom means peace. So Solomon, actually his name means peace, and it ends here in verse 4 and says he had peace on all sides. And so we then pick up with Proverbs. Now, I'm not going to go through Proverbs. I'm not going to look at the Proverbs, but I want you to see something here. It's something I one time was going to sleep. I couldn't go to sleep, and so I said, well, I'll just read. And so I picked up the Bible, and for some reason I turned to Proverbs, and I started reading Proverbs, and I didn't quit until I got to chapter 11 or 12, but there was something I saw, and I want you to see it. The first 10, should I say that? First 9 chapters of Proverbs are really not Proverbs, not like the rest of the book. Okay? What you will find in these first 9 chapters is, I think there's 12. There's 12 or 13 sections. And they start, or they say something like this, very similar. Like in chapter 1, verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and do not forsake your mother's teachings. Hear, my son, your father's instructions, and do not forsake your mother's teachings. Indeed, he says in verse 9, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments around your neck. And so it starts there. Right after he says this in verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And then he says, hear, my son, your father's instructions, and do not forsake your mother's teachings. That's in chapter 8. In chapter 2, verse 1, my son, if you will receive my sayings and treasure my commands within you. Chapter 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my teachings, and do not let your heart, but let your heart keep my commandments. Number 4 is verse 11 of chapter 3. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord, or loathe his reproof. Number 5 in verse 21. My son, let them not depart from your sight. Number 6 is chapter 4, verse 1. Hear, my son, the instruction of a father, and give attention that you may gain understanding. Number 7 is verse 10. Hear, my son, and accept my sayings. Number 8 is verse 20. My son, give attention to my words, incline your ears to my sayings. Number 9 is chapter 5, verse 1. My son, give attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding. Number 10 is in chapter 6, verse 10. My son, observe the commandments of your father, and do not forsake the teachings of your mother. Number 11 is chapter 7, verse 1. My son, keep my words and treasure my commandments within you. And number 12 is, I missed one somewhere. Well, maybe it's only 11. I thought sure there was 12 or 13. Did I skip over one? Well, it doesn't look like I did. But over and over, Solomon says, my son, keep my instructions. And each one of these gives a little different flavor for why and what. He goes into different aspects of why we need to learn to keep our father's and our mother's instructions. You remember, Jesus. First, God says, if you want to live long, obey your mother and fathers. That was one of the 10 Commandments. And Ephesians, Paul says, children, obey your mother and father, for this is the first commandment with a promise. A lot of times, I've talked to people, they hate their parents. Their parents did something wrong. They will not now honor them. Why do we have a lot of older people in nursing homes and things like that? Because we, as the children, don't want to have anything to do with them. And unfortunately, that's wrong. And I just want to encourage you. The Psalms are written as a way of showing, here are the things that we need to do. But it starts with learning and hearing what your mother and father said. It's interesting that Solomon is the one that said, Lord, I need discernment, because he is the product of sin. David slept with Bathsheba while she was married to Uriah. It was adultery. And there was a baby produced in that consummation, which died. But then after he kills Uriah, he marries Bathsheba, and they have Solomon. And yet Solomon was able to grow out of that, which I think kind of shows what wisdom there was with Bathsheba and David to produce a child that would follow the Lord. I will encourage you and follow the Lord. You know, I've got to go. I have so much more to tell you, but we'll talk about it next time. God bless you. Have a great week. I'll see you next time.